Good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me to speak. I haven't given a talk in 12 years, so bear with me, please. And I'm glad we're ahead because I've got a flight to catch. I'm going to Baton Rouge to watch the Florida Gators beat LSU. So, do I control this? Cool. So I'm going to be talking today about CML or... Sorry. See, I told you, I haven't done it in 12 years. So I'm going to be talking about chronic myelogenous leukemia or CML. And I'm really not going to be talking about the newest and latest in the treatment of CML, but I'm going to be telling you the story of how the treatment of CML evolved from primitive treatments to the molecular era. I do believe that this story is one of the best success stories in medicine. So just a quick introduction to CML. It's a proliferative disorder of the hematopoietic stem cells. The median age, if you're looking at clinical trials, is 45 to 55. In bone marrow transplant trials, it's even lower at 40. And according to the SEER data, the median age is 67, because patients enrolled on trials are a little bit more selected, and more so with the bone marrow transplant trials. The incidence of CML does increase with age. It's a slightly higher incidence in males than females, and the incidence is not increased in the offspring of patients with CML. Ionizing radiation is really the only known risk factor. CML has three clinical phases: the chronic phase, on the other end of the spectrum, there is the blastic phase, which is when it transforms into an acute leukemic process. And there's a phase in between called the accelerated phase, which is about to become acute leukemia. These days, about 50% of the time, the diagnosis is made on routine laboratory studies. You go out, get your annual CBC, the white blood count is elevated, you do more evaluation, and then you're diagnosed with CML. And about 80 to 85% of patients these days are diagnosed in the chronic phase. Some of the primitive treatments in the 1800s and early 1900s, we used different things: splenectomy, arsenic, radiation, benzene, nitrogen mustard, all kinds of interesting treatments. And then maybe the first potentially scientific treatment was the busulfan, which was introduced for clinical trials in 1953 and demonstrated activity against CML, and basically became the mainstay of CML treatment for the next 30 to 40 years. After busulfan, we had hydroxyurea, which was also shown to be active against CML. So it was tested in a head-to-head clinical trial, hydroxyurea versus busulfan. The study was published in Blood in 1993. And if you look at the curves, there is a separation between the hydroxyurea and the busulfan curves with a very significant p-value favoring hydroxyurea. So hydroxyurea took over busulfan and became the treatment of choice for CML. And then we had interferon, the very toxic agent, but it was shown to be active against CML, so it was again tested in a randomized clinical trial against busulfan and hydroxyurea, again published in Blood in 1994. And these are the curves. The interferon is the blue curve, and the hydroxyurea is the red, and that's that yellow, and the busulfan is yellow. So there was the interferon compared to busulfan was significantly, with a significant p-value, better than busulfan. There was a trend towards improved outcomes with the interferon when compared to hydroxyurea, but the p-value was not was not clinically significant, although there was a trend towards improvement. And then we had the cytarabine, or Ara-C, which is a cytotoxic agent that also was shown to be active against CML. So a combination of interferon and cytarabine, or Ara-C, was compared to interferon as a single agent, 1997 New England Journal of Medicine, and it demonstrated the superiority of the combination of interferon with cytarabine with a significant p-value. So entering the molecular era, well, before that, let me just say that, over the years, we did improve the outcomes for patients with CML. The green curve is 1990 to 2002. The white curve is for 1982 to 1989, and then 75 to 81, and 65 to 74. So over the years, there was improvement in the outcomes of CML, and that's, 2002 is when we entered the molecular era of CML. So while it was officially in 2002, the history of it actually goes back to the 1960s, when we started doing cytogenetic analysis on bone marrow specimens. And the researchers, they were mainly at University of Pennsylvania and Fox Chase Cancer Center in Philadelphia. They noticed that almost every patient with CML has a genetic abnormality on cytogenetic analysis. So that cytogenetic abnormality was called the Philadelphia chromosome. And it was the first genetic abnormality to be associated with any human cancer, again described by the researchers from Pennsylvania and Fox Chase in Philadelphia. Initially, they thought there was a genetic material partially deleted from chromosome 22, resulting in a shortened chromosome 22. With further research, what they found was that the genetic material from chromosome 22 was actually not lost, but it was translocated to chromosome 9 as follows. So we have chromosome 9 and chromosome 22. Chromosome 9 is the longer one. If you look at the bottom, that's the ABL gene. It's at the lower end of chromosome 9. And the shorter one is chromosome 22. And if you notice, that white bar says BCR. So that's the BCR gene. So what happens is that the lower part of chromosome 22 translocates to chromosome 9, and the lower part of chromosome 9 translocates to chromosome 22. So on that side of the slide, you see chromosome 22 is a little bit shorter because the material that was translocated, the genetic material translocated to it, was smaller than what it gave to chromosome 9. So what this resulted in is the ABL gene from chromosome 9 becoming next to the BCR gene on chromosome 22. So that's what we call fusion genes. So these are two genes that got together. So what does that do? Why is that always present in CML? So the BCR-ABL gene, fusion gene, codes for a protein, an enzyme, which is a tyrosine kinase. You probably remember from chemistry and organic chemistry that tyrosine kinase is an enzyme that catalyzes the transfer of phosphate groups from ATP to its substrates, giving them energy and thus activating the substrate. So that's what this BCR-ABL protein does. You have the ATP molecule. It goes to the BCR-ABL, which transforms the phosphate group to the substrate, and then the substrate activates a cascade downstream, and that keeps the disease going. That's how CML continues and progresses and unfortunately killed patients. So the researchers said, well, we now know what's going on in CML. We know that there is a fusion gene that leads to a protein, which is an enzyme, which transfers phosphates group to its substrates and keep the disease going. So they started looking at drug development. Is there anything we can do to inhibit this protein? And we had this guy, that's imatinib. That's the chemical form of it. It is an inhibitor of KIT, BCR-ABL, and PDGFR A and B. It was first tested in Philadelphia positive CML. What it does is the imatinib occupies the pocket of the kinase, protein kinase, and it prevents ATP from getting to the kinase and thus does not allow to transfer the phosphate groups from ATP to the substrate like this. So it sits there, doesn't allow ATP to reach the kinase, and there is no downstream signal. So this was developed through, in my opinion, amazing science to specifically target that protein that's active all the time. So they took imatinib to clinical trials. The first 3 trials were phase 2 trials, study 110, 19, and 102 in chronic phase, accelerated phase, and the blastic phase. And they demonstrated activity against CML, which led to the phase 3 randomized clinical trial called the IRIS study. It's for patients only in the chronic phase of the disease. It's the international randomized interferon versus imatinib study. It was a big study, more than 1,000 patients were enrolled. If you look at the study design, it's important because it allows for crossover. That's going to become relevant in a few minutes here. So the patients were randomized 1-to-1 to either imatinib, or it's called also Gleevec, versus the standard of care before the molecular era, which is interferon and Ara-C. The crossover was because of either you do not achieve a major cytogenetic response or a complete hematologic response at 1 year, losing your response, increasing white blood count, intolerance, or life-threatening toxicities. Those were the reasons to cross over between the 2 arms. So again, it's chronic phase, diagnosed within 6 months, no prior therapy, and it's in the chronic phase. There was 1,106 patients randomized 1-to-1 to imatinib versus interferon and Ara-C. And this is the time to progression with imatinib. Seriously, is that orange or red? I'm not sure. I'm going to say orange. So the orange curve is imatinib, and the green one is interferon with Ara-C. Clearly, the time of progression favored imatinib significantly over interferon and Ara-C. And that applied to everything. CHR is complete hematologic response. MCR is major cytogenetic response, and CCR is complete cytogenetic response. It's more clear orange here. So 96% versus 56%, complete hematologic response, 85% versus 22%, 74 versus 9 for the complete cytogenetic response. So clearly, imatinib was superior. Now, this is the survival at 8 months. PFS is progression-free survival. PFS AP BC is progression-free survival without transforming to accelerated phase or blastic phase. And then the OS is overall survival. You could tell that the progression-free survival clearly favored imatinib, but the overall survival, was really not that different. Well, we go back to the crossover that the study design allowed. At the end of the day, only 8% of patients who started with interferon and Ara-C stayed on that. And 61% of patients who started with interferon and Ara-C crossed to the imatinib arm for many different reasons. And we do know that imatinib salvages patients who progressed on interferon and Ara-C, but interferon does not do the same for patients who progressed on imatinib. So for complete hematologic response for second line, imatinib, 82% complete hematologic response versus 27%, 56 for major cytogenetic response, and 40 for complete cytogenetic response when the number for interferon is 0. So those patients who crossed over, they were salvaged and they survived. That's why the overall survival was similar between these two arms. So this is the slide of the overall survival on first-line imatinib. And the upper curve is survival without CML-related events, 95%, and 89% is the overall survival. Those were numbers that we have never heard of in CML or probably in any other malignancy at that time. I remind you with this slide that showed how the curves did before the molecular era, and the yellow curve on the top is the imatinib. So 90 to 95% of patients are surviving with this disease. The median survival for CML before imatinib became available with all these aggressive treatments, including allogeneic bone marrow transplants, the median survival was 5 to 7 years. Now, the median survival for CML on imatinib has not been reached. So through real nice science, we were able to change a disease that killed people in 5 to 7 years to a disease that people are now living with as a chronic illness with really minimal toxicity to the treatments. And I think that was my last slide. Thank you. Any questions?
Any questions?
What's wrong with you?
You talk about the molecular era. What is what marks the molecular era? How do we know what changed that made it suddenly the molecular era?
Well, we called it molecular era when we moved from doing just cytotoxic agents to targeted agents. That's what we call the molecular era. I can change the name if you want.
I was just wondering.
There's nothing magical about the name.
When you have a patient that's diagnosed, is it more of a symptomatic finding or incidental?
So these days, like I said earlier, 50% of patients are diagnosed through routine laboratory studies. And 85% are diagnosed in the chronic phase. Those patients typically have minimal symptoms, but then the accelerated phase, the blastic phase, that's when they start developing progressive fatigue, fevers, chills, sweats, weight loss, all these symptoms. But these days, half on routine, 85% in the chronic phase.
Perfect. Any other questions? Okay, thank you very
All
much.
right, thank you, and go Gators.